Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. I am so honored to be here in Honolulu, invited by the museum, and to be part of the exhibition on Doris Duke's Shangri. So I appreciate everybody here and your time and your interest in my work. For me, art is not just an impulse to make aesthetically pleasing objects. It has been an instinct to think and imagine the future. Ideas are a powerful entity, and creativity is essential to all of us in harnessing our thoughts, impulses, desires, and dispositions into expression. An artist often has the burden to reimagine. In reimagining lies the ability to break molds and re-examine the norms. Contemporaneity is about remaining relevant by challenging the status quo, not about holding on to positions of power. It is this spirit that guides me and is the fundamental reason for continuing to explore and experiment. In 1987, I was looking outward to the world as a young person, feeling very lucky to have ventured into the arts. The National College of Arts in Lahore, Pakistan, became my beacon, nurturing curiosity and intellectual debate, and a commitment to the creative process. It was within this environment that I chose to engage with miniature painting. During a time when it was not popular, what others saw as an enslavement to craft and technique, I saw as a path to opening possibilities for dialogue. It was exciting to examine, imagine, and explore the many possibilities of miniature painting, whose future as a contemporary mode of expression had not yet been laid out in any clear terms in the late 80s and early 90s in Lahore, Pakistan. In 1991, I put out my thesis focusing on experimentation. My primary work was a scroll, which was the first time anyone in the miniature department had attempted to create a 5-foot miniature. The scroll, which you see on the top, was a game changer because it went beyond boundaries of what it meant to create a contemporary miniature. Instead of depicting a contemporary version of a traditional ritual, I was interested in inserting the personal into a thematic space, exploring the insertion of the youth, the flux of identity, the narrative as a moving image, and the picture plane as an infinite space. So I was looking at narratives, structures in film and cinema when I was conceptually laying down the foundation for the scroll. So when I juxtapose it to a very recent project of mine, I still see a lot of similarities between both the works. I have explored issues of scale, particularly in the early to mid-90s, when I was taking elements out of my small drawings and placing them in ephemeral situations like temporary wall and floor drawings. So much discussion exists on this shifting of scale of miniature work to include large-scale murals and installations by my dialogue with Homi Bhabha, who I met through the Renaissance Society in 1998, and his book, Location of Culture, was of great influence on my practice. The period from 1989 to 97 was of extreme experimentation with miniature. During this period, I also moved to the US in 1993. However, I was already experimenting with the medium of miniature, and it was not that the move to the West dictated the need to deconstruct. In the 90s also, I basically laid down the groundwork for many new directions, which would include the medium, extension into installation work, public murals, multimedia work, as well as collaboration with other artists. So some of the early works engaged the wall and paper as material to create paintings. And I was interested in breaking the preciousness of the miniature to give a sense of the ephemeral nature that was also within the medium, because the medium is all water-based and it's done in layers, so it's built delicately to create like layers of light. And at the same time, I was interested in examining how value gets determined when you're dealing with issues around labor. So the departures, this is from 1997. This was my first exhibition in New York City, which was at the Drawing Center. The departures or ruptures that happened were varied in both technique and form. So I was also interested in removing the center and the margin relationships of the miniature painting, because it comes out of book illustration. So there's a very unique structure, compositional structure, because a lot of the pages were torn out of books. So the paper becomes like a very interesting medium for me. Paper as a surface, paper as material, paper as layering facet, paper also as a concept of its engagement with the book. This work was done in actually 2010 at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo. And I think my interest in doing this work there was, again, interest throughout the years in ink painting, ink drawing, the usage of ink, and like pushing the boundary of ink, as well as, again, in the sort of like interest in paper, especially in context to Japanese paintings. Out of working at that scale, a lot of work sometimes happens that is unpredictable, unexpected. So I'm also interested in this sort of dichotomy in two gestures and bringing elements from the large scale back into the small scale. And through that process, finding like vocabulary that gets born. But, there's always reading, there is literature, interest in literature, and recently more in poetry. But in the 90s, I was also working with this artist, Sharmila Desai, who choreographed pieces based on my drawings and floor paintings. And I was reading Helen Sossoud, Julia Kristeva. I was very interested in Eva Hesse's work, also in Amrita Shergill's. And this is also work when, in the 90s, there was a lot of emphasis on identity-based work. Hence, there's an interest in my own sort of like an understanding of how one's own language gets determined, especially when one is very much examining a traditional genre. So the relationships started in my work. There was a heightened engagement at that time with feminism and sexuality, as well as incorporating a postmodern identity. So I was interested in cultural semiotics, also including Hindu-Muslim iconographies, and in juxtaposing anti-classical impulses in Western art, such as mannerism, with a variety of outside aesthetics. Such one example is this image that I made, which was created for a banner for the Museum of Modern Art. And the two female forms here are from different historical sources, Western and Eastern, yet on close inspection, one can see that the nude from Bronzino is an example of the Mannerist tradition, the anti-classical impulse in Western art, its relationship with another outcast, the Indian aesthetic. Within the 19th century, European scholarship is full of multiple meanings. What is the nature of their relationship? Who is in the position of power? It was also a play on the words MoMA, and it refers to Partha Mitter's book, Much Maligned Monsters. So over the years, I have continued to work with all different types of mediums and scales, but here I'm just going to show you a variety of drawings, which are the basis of doing recent animation work. They are all in ink, so I'm interested in the dislocation of objects and forms and how meaning is constantly in flux. Historically, the movement of objects, such as in trade and in colonial occupation, often allowed their meaning to shift as they entered different contexts. And also, while working in animation, there was another shift that happened from the page from the sheet of paper and a page into a third dimension, fourth dimension, especially as a means to develop score and work with composers and poets. So that kind of shift is indicative of another sort of pushing the scale and the boundaries. And that brings me to like a recent work of mine that I would like to share. It's called Parallax. And this work was done in 2013 for the Sharjah Art Biennial. It's a multi-channel video work composed of hundreds of tiny drawings which have been digitally scanned and animated. The work deals with the history of maritime trade in the Strait of Hormuz, particularly the fraught history of imperial control, focusing on Sharjah's unique location at the Strait of Hormuz and the area's historical power tensions. The animation is inspired by bringing together elements which also play with the relationship of drawing and the digital space. So what I was interested was that when I took, say, 3 inches out of my drawing and scanned it and then digitally expanded it to 70 feet, I was actually not even aware of the drawn work. So what became visible was not even visible to the naked eye. So that type of expansion or extension was less about scaling up the image and more about creating 2 parallel mediums like the digital and the drawn, and at what point do they intersect, or whether they intersect or not. So while the work was created by drawings that I did while I drove in the region. So I was very interested in driving, and I think driving for me has always been an interesting way of engaging with a new site or a new place. And it was also like navigating the terrain of a drawing. Imagine traveling inside the infinite digital space. And while I was thinking of the excessive heat, driving in the desert and the proximity of water, so very sensorial aspects of the driving experience, I was also thinking that how I was drawing these parallels between the 2 mediums, and that notion of disorientation and dissonance both became topics which got explored at length in Parallax. So Parallax ended up traveling around the world, and here it was part of the Dhaka Art Summit, and which was very interesting again because the score is in Arabic, and my interest in doing the score in Arabic was because it was done primarily for the Sharjah Art Biennial, so it was the regional language, and I worked with local poets, but then having grown up in Pakistan, I have a familiarity with Arabic, though I don't speak it, but I can read it. And I was interested in that aspect of that language, that it's very lyrical, it's very, there's a lot of emphasis on recitation, and I kind of was curious whether it would sustain itself if it went in cultures where people didn't really understand it. So there's been great response, and it seemed to also be sort of this experiment in the idea of translation, and I think translation as a topic interests me a lot. It's very prevalent in the work. I'm curious that at what point, translation determines the relationship between the concept of the original, and at what point does the translation become the original? So what is that distance between the idea of the original and its translation, and measuring that distance? So that conceptually is also a little bit of play in the work. To show you how some of the drawings functioned in the animation, I was drawing drawings in gouache of the region. I also did a lot of research, and I came across the British petroleum magazines, especially this particular image on the right is the multi-valved oil well. And I was surprised that it was called a Christmas tree. To me, it did not resemble a Christmas tree from anywhere, and I thought that its name was more a reference to its gift-bearing ability or the English wit, and I decided to build on this idea and create a fully embellished tree from the valves and spools with the chains functioning as garlands. So as the Christmas trees multiply in parallax, they also transform into a mirage or a reflection of themselves. And they also sort of become a frozen mirror, and you can see there are multiple narratives. There's a narrative happening behind and in front. And I will be able to share with you this particular work at the end of the lecture. So there is no fixed viewing point in this film. It is simultaneously aerial and internal. And the poetry, here you can also see some of the poets that contributed to the work. They performed live with the composer De Yun, who composed the score. My work often engages paradoxes, polarities, open-ended narratives, and Parallax deals with questions of translation and point of view. And I was, and moving forward from there, I did another work called Pivot, which was similar in format, and but it was done in Turkish, and it was for the Istanbul Biennial. So in 2013, I was researching on social media and was aware of what was going on in the Gezi Park and the protests happening around there. So I came across several of Nazim Hikmat's graffitied words. So at that time, I also, since I was working with poetry, I was like curious to bring Nazim Hikmat's work back into the work that I was going to create. So I ended up creating Pivot, which basically deals with two separate generations of poets talking to each other. So it opens with Lale Muldur reciting her poem Waking to Constantinople, and transitions into young poet Firat Demir's voice. And what happened was that there were roughly 10 poems that were sung and recited by a wide range of people in Istanbul that volunteered. They were conservatory-trained sopranos, news anchors, students, security workers, to name a few. And they also performed live. So I think moving backward from this type of work, while I was driving in the region, I came across this particular cinema. It was just this site which I was interested in because it was an anomaly amongst the drive to build new spaces and in that particular area where everything is being built fast in UAE. This was like a stagnating space. So I became curious. So when I asked for access, I came across the guard who happened to be from Pakistan. And he came in 1976 to build the building. So he came as a laborer to build the building, and his visa was still attached to the architecture. And that was really kind of a powerful notion for me because he was literally attached and married to this building, and the building was in decay. So I couldn't help but think of him, and he becomes part of my narrative and the work that I ended up creating. So drawn images were projected inside the cinema in various locations, and at times the projection symbolically brought back the cinema to life for the caretaker. The title of the work is written in Urdu in the back. It's called The Cypress, Despite Its Freedom, is Held Captive to the Garden. It's a phrase from the poet Ghalib's work. And in the spirit of his poetry, which is multidimensional and full of multiple meanings, the use of the phrase is also meant to elicit multiple reads. So what was basically of interest to me was our crossovers, both of us in this sort of transitory space. And this was his life, his love, his existence so intricately intertwined with the space that the imminent death of the cinema in my eyes became a metaphor for his life's labor. He, on the other hand, spoke of the space as if it was still alive and functional, unable to see the layers of dust and decay around him, a soul survivor held captive to a dream. So I am interested in the nature of relationship between image and text. Early on, this is from '92, I did this work called Riding the Written, and it was a play, again, compositionally on the page, torn out of the book, but how like certain visual relationship to the written word. And because I was engaged with miniature painting, and miniature paintings also have a strong relationship to the book and text, but text is usually in the back side of the image. So unfortunately, when you see them hung in exhibitions, you're less aware of their relationship to text. And that became of interest to me. So I have used text throughout my work with that notion in mind that what happens when, things are torn out of their original context and often are at the mercy of collectors and dealers, and how meaning is added later. So this disjuncture and visual unfamiliarity, especially with the Arabic or Persian and Urdu script, is, I think, of an interesting concept too. And this particular painting that I did here, you can see a detail. It takes one phrase, which is on unrequited love, I am also not my own enemy, and with just simple black ink, it's like repeated. So it was also on repetition, it was on rote learning, and it's the music sheet is from the bugle call, the end of the day, or the commemorating death, but it's also a bugle call from the English history, still functional in Pakistani military space, and the music sheet is the last post. And here the work becomes even more abstracted, because as the ink drips, it kind of became like it developed a sensibility of like encapsulating itself, and then blending different colors. So the rawness of the ink and its fragility also add to the momentum and the rhythm and the thrust of the work. In this particular work, I took Arabic and Hebrew words, and they were words, but the root word is murder, murdered, murderer, and what I did was like assemble them and then rebuilt them till they started to look like barbed wires and got intertwined with each other. So this type of abstraction is not just based on text, it's also based on elements that I have taken. For example, the hair that I've abstracted from the little characters Gopi that are worshippers of Krishna god in Hindu mythology. Here I have used them in one of the projections that I did at Shangri, and moving forward into this particular project, which I had the opportunity to work on it twice. So in 2009 and 2011, I was here invited by the Doris Foundation for Islamic Art, and these large-scale projections were done at night. Here I wanted to show you how an 11 by 14-inch drawing, when I projected it into space, it basically fell onto the trees, the foliage, the garden, the landscape, and it was very fascinating for me to see it basically bring to light so much aspects of this relationship between the landscape as well as the architecture of that building. And I think that aspect of Shangri-La was the first immediate thing that came to my mind when I first got there, was that the inside-outside relationship was very much in sync with the nature that it was part of. The gardens were done impeccably, and at any point inside the building, you were so aware of its relationship to nature. So these projections are this work is documentation of the projections which were done at nighttime. And what happened was that while I was projecting elements that I had drawn in response to the space that was available as an artist for me to explore, to see all the objects, to see the collections. But then what I did was I took those drawings and threw them back at the site. That transformation was of interest, that gesture. It was almost like doing putting your mark into space and doing sculptural works all out of light. And at the same time, they were meditative, they were not intrusive, and they also allowed me to work at night, and I'm a night person. So it was a very interesting way of coming with solutions around this aspect of a residency. When artists come to residencies in a short period of time, often there's no real pressure to make work, but that pressure is exciting too, because it makes you, work and think faster, and often you can come up with good ideas, and sometimes you don't. So this was a great opportunity, because I came up with the idea towards the end of the residency, and then as I was leaving, I wished I could have done it better, and then I was invited again, and I brought the right projectors. So this work has been received so well, and it gives me great pleasure to be back here to share it again. This particular one was an image, really a homage to Doris Duke, who is such a mythical, monumental figure, and there were so many narratives around her. So this was like the goddess fluttering out of the bedroom suite, overlooking the Pacific, which is an incredible physical aspect, especially at night, and where her ashes were also sprinkled. So it's the paradox of Shangri-La is in this image. It's omnipresent. It's got its American Orientalism, stunning craft work, collections from many Muslim cultures, and it's incredibly exciting and engaging. And of course, it has a lot of contradictions too. So perhaps since I really would like to show the animation, so I'm going to exit here. The animation is about 15 minutes, and after that we can have a Q&A. Thank you.
والهاجس المجروح في رئة الرؤى أدماء النوح واستباح صوابي كل المواكب للكواكب سافر كل المواكب للكواكب سافرت إلا ذنوبي لا تزال جواكب أتصحر للرمي في عهد ندويناه بل إن صادروا أفكاري قد هاجرت الدار مكسور الخطى متلفت نحو الأهالي شاكية هذه أساطير الدكاترة تشتكي وبدت أساطير الرواتع رأسي
والموج المتردد يفتح أصداف الحب فلا لؤلؤ لا حلم ولا أمنيات والمقهى يعتقد قلب تبحث كان بجنب الواقف عن آخر ورد كنت كتبته عن آخر ورد في زاوية اللقاء أنت تركته أبدأه اليعطف ذات عبير في عيني وعلى طاولة الصمت أغمض قبضته والإشارة على كفيه لم يفهم لغة البعد لم يكتب شيئا بعد فقع هناك يدي المقهى هل كان هناك حقا مقهى الحمد بقرمة روحي يتمناك
الحزن سنيني والتوى عصف البؤس وأدمى أضلعي كم تردى في فرحي قد صوى وتهاوى الشوق يغزو مضجعي قد تعثرت بحظي في التوى كاحل الحظ غدا لم يرجعي ويح شعري ويح شعري لاح موتي واقتوى وفد قلبي والهوى لم يفزعي ذاك نبض الطهر يسري من الهوى وشموخي لم يهن لم يضرعي يا شهي الروح يا شهي الروح جرحي من طوى في عيوني قد تبدى مطمعي فاسكب الأحلام هيا والدوى لا تبالي بالشقاء في قلبي قد هوى مسه الدهر فهل بأدمعي ليلي الهدام
وجدت دنياك مفتونا بحضرتها مستمتعا، جئت مصحوبا بألوية، أتيت أغصن كحل الورد في مدني وأسعى.
تدرين من الباب يسألها
وقفت
تعال
الوحدة
نقرأ
تقي التفاؤل
وبعد
الداخلي
قصائد
والنية وخلوص
بسحاب قلل بالحب يا سقي انتظاري والريح كأني ما عرفت الماء يوما أطفئي جوي عطش وناري وأتته تلمسني أبوك لن أقول له كتبتك في قصيدة وأتته تعجن غيمة خجلة وتسكن
على أطراف أصابع السنين وعلى أنغام تصاميم دقائق الثواني الهكذا فلا أعرف أين أخبئ بسالات زمان يتسارع جنون الموسيقى ويخيل إلي كأن مقاطع هنا وهنا ليبدأ جسدي المؤقت بطعنات الريح
ويغرق الشعر في كراس ملهمة غدا سأطوي انتهاء الحظ بغسق وقائمة